Hi everybody, I am Johanna Varner.
And I'm Patrice Connors.
And today we're going to take you on a tour of the Riparian ecosystem near the Audubon Trail in Grand Junction.
Right, so the goal of today's virtual field trip is to introduce to you the plant species that we find in this type of habitat, specifically the riparian habitat, as well as how to use a dichotomous key to identify these species.
So we're here today at the Audubon Trail and near the Safeway Plaza in the Redlands in Grand Junction, but really a lot of these different kinds of techniques and plants that we are going to introduce you to in today's video, you would be able to see in any other riparian ecosystem in this area.
Yes, so some of the plants that you'll see, as Dr. Varner said, are plants that you'll see here, but you may also see some of these plants in other habitats that are local here to Grand Junction.
So without further ado, let's get started. So riparian is a word that refers to the land, the soil, the water, and all of the vegetation surrounding a river area like this one, the Colorado River. All of this extra water allows for a lot of different kinds of plant species to persist in riparian areas that you wouldn't find around the sort of other areas around Grand Junction. One of the big differences that you'll notice about this area is that a lot of the leaves have big, broad leaves, and those big broad leaves allow those plants to conduct photosynthesis more effectively, but they also lose a lot of water. In a riparian area, there's plenty of water, so the plants don't have to worry as much about losing water. But you'll notice that they're very, very different than the different kinds of plants that you might find around the Colorado National Monument and other pinyon juniper ecosystems around Grand Junction.
So riparian habitats offer a lot of different ecosystem services, right? So these are services that the habitats just naturally provide, and sometimes we as humans take them for advantage. So some things that occur here in riparian zones is, first and foremost, there's lots of really large trees. So this type of vegetation provides cover that helps to lower the water temperature that comes through. Not only are there a lot of different types of plant species, but this means the plant species offer a lot of food, a lot of cover, and even nesting areas for many different animal species. We see that the riparian areas actually help to keep the water on land long enough to recharge aquifers and help capture sediment and even provide resilience in periods of drought. And lastly, riparian areas also offer a lot of human recreation. I, for one, have floated the Colorado River, which has been pretty fun. So not only can you go swimming, but you can go fishing and boating and other sorts of recreation activities. And riparian areas just also offer a lot of aesthetics. It's a nice place to come, it's quiet, and it's peaceful. So these are all the different services that riparian habitats have to offer us.
All right, so today we're going to teach you how to use a dichotomous key as a way of identifying plants. Before you get started using the dichotomous key, I really recommend that you take a minute to familiarize yourself with the terms that are in the glossary. So this might be a good idea for you to pause the video for a minute and have a look at the glossary. This will help you familiarize yourself with terms, things like strobilus, samara, and spike, which you may not be familiar with. Dichotomous keys are a way of identifying plants, and it's kind of like a choose your own adventure story, except that at the end you don't have a story resolution, but you have a plant identification. Dichotomous keys are, just as the name implies, dichotomous. This means that it's a yes or no question. So at each stage along the key, you're going to be asked a question: does the plant have this characteristic, yes or no? And then the dichotomous key will tell you where to go next in your plant identification journey. So I'm going to show you how this works by using an aspen. So you can tell that this tree is an aspen because of the way that it is, but also you can tell that the tree is an aspen by using the dichotomous key. So the first question that you'll see on the key is whether or not the plant has a strobilus. I'm going to look across the tree, see if I see any strobili. I don't see any strobili, so I think we can safely move on to number 2. The second question is whether the plant is woody or herbaceous. So keep in mind that herbaceous, this means things like grasses and flowers that don't have any woody stems. This plant clearly does have a woody stem, so I'm going to safely move on to number 3. Number 3 is asking whether or not the tree is a tree or a shrub, so whether or not it has a centralized trunk. We can see that although this trunk branches down low towards the bottom, it is actually have a centralized trunk, so we can safely say it is a tree. Next, we're going to look at whether or not the leaves are opposite or adjacent. So I'm going to have a look at these leaves. When I look at the way that they come off of the stem, I can see that they are adjacent. They're not arranged oppositely on the stem. Finally, I'm going to look and see whether or not the tree produces a catkin, which is a specialized kind of reproductive structure. Now for this question, you'll have to make sure that you're looking at a girl tree, because a catkin is a special kind of flower, and that's where the flowers are produced. So when I look up in here, it's not a great time of year, but I think I see a couple of old catkins up there at the top, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Next question, number 6, is going to be whether or not the tree has deep, dark, furrowed bark or white, smooth bark. And hopefully you can see from the tree here that it has the white, smooth bark, and so we can safely conclude that it is an aspen tree.
Now you go try to identify a tree using your dichotomous key. All right, what we have here is the cottonwood tree. So we know it's a tree because there's a large central trunk, and in fact, what you'll notice along even the branches that come off the trunk is that the bark is very deeply furrowed. This is a key feature of our cottonwood trees. Another key feature of the cottonwood tree is that it is basically the largest tree that we find within riparian areas. And in fact, as someone who's driven across parts of the western United States through desert habitats, you know you come up to a riparian area when you see those really tall cottonwood trees and then a bunch of small greenery below it. So some other key characteristics of our cottonwood tree, besides being one of the largest, is that they have really unique, simple leaves. They look pretty similar actually to aspen trees because they're closely related. And what you'll notice is that the leaves coming off the stem are in fact alternate. So that's another key feature of these plants. Another important role that these trees play within the riparian habitat is not only do they offer shade and help keep water close to the surface like a lot of our other plants, but they provide housing and habitat for a lot of different animal species. In fact, a common species that you'll see living in these trees, even within the Grand Valley and along Grand Junction River, are great horned owls. So keep an eye out for them. They are pretty darn cool. Other fun fact about these trees is that people really enjoy the look of them and plant them on their properties. However, for these plants, there are in fact separate individuals in terms of sex. So you can actually find or purchase male trees versus female trees. The female trees are the trees that produce the cottony catkins, which is how this plant gets its name. Therefore, homeowners usually do not purchase female trees. They purchase the male trees instead. The male trees are the ones that produce the pollen, which is what actually makes allergies worse.
All right, here we have another very unique plant to riparian ecosystems, and this is one that's going to be very easy for you to identify on the dichotomous key, because in the first step, the key asks, does the plant have a strobolus? If you take a close look at this plant, it does! I found a strobolus! So we have identified a horsetail from the very first step. Horsetails are actually more closely related to ferns than anything else, and they're a very ancient lineage of plants. They may have been some of the first vascular plants to evolve on Earth. They're called a seedless vascular plant, which means that they produce spores instead of seeds, and the spores are in fact produced in the strobolus structure. Sometimes people call these plants scouring rushes because they also are heavily fortified with silica, which makes them very abrasive. Strobolus, 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 strobolus!
All right, so here we have another native species to the riparian habitat. This is the box elder tree. There's a couple key features to this tree to help us identify it. First and foremost, one of those things that we look at are the leaves. So this tree has a compound leaf. This is a really good example right here behind my hand. This would be a compound leaf. Oh, hey, little spider. Because we have 3 leaves that are slightly different in shape, kind of all breaking off together. So that's a key feature of our box elder tree, the fact that there's compound leaves. Another key feature, which hopefully you see right here, are these really specialized seeds. I used to call them helicopter seeds. They're actually called samaras. This particular tree uses wind as a means of dispersal to spread those seeds. So in fact, if you've never seen a helicopter seed, they're so named because usually they twirl as they come down. So this would be a prime example of our box elder tree.
Here we have one plant that is very unique to riparian areas. It's called a cattail, presumably because it looks like the tail of a cat. Cattails require a lot of water, so we really only find them in riparian areas like this one. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of standing water right down here that I'm trying very hard not to fall into. The most distinguishing factor of the cattails is their inflorescence here. It's called a spike, and actually many parts of the cattail are edible.
All right, and what we have here is a native plant to the riparian habitat. This tall, big leaf plant right here is what we call a milkweed plant. So these guys you will find in the riparian habitat, really like being close to water. In fact, you often find them next to our horsetails. Some key features of this plant: really big leaves, simple leaves. These leaves are opposite, a really nice example of that, where they break off at the same point on the stem. And then another key feature of these guys is they have a really unique reproductive structure, which you see right here. This actually releases a bunch of seeds that are then wind dispersed. Other cool thing about this plant is that they have a pretty interesting relationship with monarch butterflies. So when those insects are caterpillars, they actually feed on these milkweed plants. When milkweed plants, you'll notice if you break off a leaf that they'll produce a waxy white substance. The caterpillars are actually able to eat this substance. That substance produces a toxin. The caterpillars are able to take that toxin in, and the caterpillars themselves are able to use that same substance as a defense against predators. So pretty interesting relationship there between a pretty cool bug and a pretty cool plant.
Here's another plant that we find in riparian ecosystems, but it may look familiar to you if you have already toured other ecosystems in Grand Junction. This is rabbitbrush, and it's found broadly across lots of different kinds of ecosystems here in the Grand Valley. One of the things that sets rabbitbrush apart, of course, you could use the key to identify it based on its leaves and its flowers, but you'll oftentimes also see these small fuzzy balls growing on the side of the rabbitbrush. And these small fuzzy balls may look like some kind of seed pod or maybe some kind of like wind dispersed seed fluff, but in fact there is a very interesting story going on inside. What's happening here is that actually there is a fly called a gall fly, and it lays an egg on the rabbitbrush itself. That egg then secretes chemicals that entice the rabbitbrush to build a gall, which is sort of a home for its baby insect, and then the baby fly develops inside, feeding on the nutrients of the rabbitbrush itself.
All right, so what we have here is a sagebrush plant. This is a plant that is native here to the Grand Valley area, and that you'll actually find in various different habitats, including the riparian habitat. So if you've done another field trip for your class already, you've probably already met this plant. If you have not, let me introduce you to the sagebrush. Okay, so some key features about this plant is that they have very small leaves that are simple, kind of branching off in an alternate pattern. Other fun feature about this plant, it is very aromatic. So if you just even rub your hand on the leaves a little bit, or after the rain, when there's a bit more water in the air, you'll get a really unique sage-like smell. Last thing about this plant is that it gets its scientific name from its actually leaf morphology, or what the leaves look like. Scientific name for this plant is Artemisia tridentata. Tridentata referring to the fact of three-toothed. And if we zoom in quickly on one of these leaves, you'll actually see that there's three specific bumps or grooves at the distal end of the leaf, which is how it gets its name.
But humans have also had a lot of impacts in these riparian areas, and these impacts include agriculture, livestock, draining down the water for irrigation, and invasive species. And we're going to go through some of the invasive species that have affected the Colorado River ecosystem in the riparian areas here around Grand Junction. All of these effects have the net effect of drawing down the water table and making that water less accessible to the native vegetation that depends on it.
So what we have here is one of the most prominent invasive species within the riparian habitat. This is a tamarisk plant, or a salt cedar. It's also known as a salt cedar because this plant has a really, its defense system is actually to concentrate the amount of salt that's found in the soil. It concentrates that salt into its leaves, and then when it drops those leaves, it basically creates a ring of salt barrier around itself, preventing other plants from growing nearby. So even though this is an invasive plant that's not originally from the United States, it has adapted to the habitats found along riparian ecosystems, particularly here in the Grand Valley, and has actually done pretty darn well. You'll often find it along the riverbanks of the Colorado River. It does a very good job to prevent erosion, but it also does a very good job of competing out native species like willows. So some key features about this plant. It has almost feathery looking leaves and branches that are a bit more scaly, almost like juniper and evergreen trees than our traditional trees that we find in the riparian habitat with those really big, broad leaves. Some other key features about this plant is that we are currently trying to control it. Scientists have identified that it is an invasive species. They're trying to reduce the numbers to allow those native plants to come back. And this is actually a pretty neat story. The way that scientists are doing this is they're using a biological control agent. What this means is that scientists are not applying pesticides or going out and trying to physically remove them, but instead what they've done is they've taken a natural predator for this plant, the tamarisk beetle, and they've bred it in the lab such that this beetle will only feed on tamarisk plants. So scientists have tested this beetle and grown this beetle in the lab for a number of years. They've now, over the past couple years, slowly been releasing these beetles into riparian habitats like those found along the Colorado River. And we are starting to see a significant tamarisk decline across the riparian habitats, including the Colorado ecosystem. Another pretty cool fact is Dr. Ozoy here at CMU is actually currently doing research with the tamarisk beetle. So if you want to know more, I'd say reach out to her. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk about it more. And that is what we need to know about the tamarisk.
So this is another one of the nasty invasive species that we find here in the Colorado River ecosystem and across many parts of Grand Junction. This is the Russian thistle, also known as tumbleweed. Now, tumbleweed may seem like kind of an iconic plant from the American West. You think of it as the cowboy movies, tumbling through the empty streets of a ghost town. But in fact, it's not native to these ecosystems, and it is also from Eastern Europe. Tumbleweed has a weak point here at the base of the stem, and when the plant is mature, the seeds are mature, the whole thing dries up, it breaks off at that weak point, and then the wind carries it along its journey. Along the way, it disperses all of its seeds.
All right, and here we have yet another invasive species for our riparian habitat. This plant is what's known as a Russian olive. It is so named because of the fruit that it produces. You can actually see one right here. It looks like a very hard grape or olive, where it gets its name. It also gets its name because, as I said, it's invasive. It's not native here to the United States. It's from Eastern Europe, as the name suggests, Russian olive. Some other key features of this plant is that the leaves are alternate. So again, if we kind of go to the outer part of our leaves, our branches and our stems, we look to see how those leaves are breaking off. They are simple, just one, but alternate. They tend to have kind of this silvery look to them. And another key feature is that these plants are heavily defended by physical thorns. Oh, and actually, you know what? I got some right here that we'll be able to take a closer look at. They're pretty spiky, so you don't want to run into them.
Siberian elm is another invasive species that comes natively from parts of North Asia and Europe. Probably the reason that we have so many plants that come from those areas is because the climates are relatively similar. And so these plants are able to survive in our climates that are similar to their native habitats. This one is the Siberian elm. You can tell the species both because of the shape of the bark that you'll see in the key, and also because of the leaves. You'll see that the leaves are alternate and toothed. Finally, Siberian elm, like the box elder, also produces a winged fruit, the samara, which I have a couple of for you to take a look at here on my clipboard. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tour of a riparian ecosystem and that you now have an appreciation for the different kinds of plants and animals that live in this unique ecosystem.
And we hope that you keep this in mind as you tour other ecosystems here in the Grand Valley, and that mostly you keep in mind the big differences in terms of those habitats between the riparian habitat, as well as maybe some other, have a better idea of identifying the plant species found in all of them.
Thanks for watching.
See ya! Which is in fact something that could that can make allergies worse. Blech. A cotton catkin. Bleh.